The door was the color of old blood. She stood there with the iron bar in her trembling hand, 22 years old and nearly weightless from hunger, staring at a sheet of welded steel that had not been opened in 50 years. The dust in the rail car hung in the slanted light like flowers suspended in still water. Somewhere far off in the woods, a crow called once and went quiet. Della Mae Crawford pressed her forehead against the cold metal and let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the day her mother died. Behind that door was either nothing or everything. She did not know yet that what waited for her on the other side would undo every belief she had ever held about who she was, where she came from, and what a man could leave behind when he had no one left to give it to. She only knew that she had spent her last $10 on a ruined train car in a forgotten forest, and that the whole village had laughed when she walked away with the deed folded against her chest. Let them laugh. She had been laughed at before. To understand how a girl with nothing in her pockets ended up alone in the Blue Ridge Mountains prying at a door that had been sealed since before her father was born, you have to go back. You have to go back to a gravel lot in Asheville, North Carolina, where a row of mobile homes leaned against the wind like tired old men in a soup line. You have to go back to Cherokee Park, where the laundromat at the entrance had 3 machines and only one of them ever worked, and the sign out front had been missing the letter A for so long that nobody remembered what it used to say. That was where Della Mae was born, in the back bedroom of a single-wide trailer, with rust eating the wheel wells in the summer of 2004. Her mother, Loretta, brought her into the world without painkillers, because the clinic was 40 minutes away, and the truck would not start. The midwife was a neighbor named Beulah, who smoked Pall Malls between contractions and told Loretta to push like she meant it. The baby came out blue and silent, and for one long second Loretta thought she had lost her. And then the little thing opened her mouth and screamed loud enough to rattle the cheap aluminum windows. Beulah laughed and said the child had her mother's lungs, and probably her stubbornness too. She was right about both. Loretta Crawford waited tables at Otis Doyle's truck stop, a low cinder block building on the shoulder of Interstate 40 where the diesel pumps stayed lit all night, and the coffee was so strong it could strip paint. She worked the graveyard shift 4 nights a week, and the breakfast rush 3 mornings, sometimes both back-to-back when the bills came due. She was a thin woman with auburn hair she pinned up under a hairnet, and she had a way of carrying 4 plates on one arm and a coffee pot in the other hand, and never spilling a drop. The truckers loved her. They tipped her in dollar bills folded into little triangles, and they told her she was the prettiest waitress between Memphis and Norfolk, which she always laughed off, but which Della knew her mother kept tucked somewhere private in her chest like a small flame. Della's father, Hollis, was supposed to be a long-haul man. He drove for a regional freight company out of Knoxville, and when Della was small, he would come home every other Friday with the cab of his truck, smelling like cigarettes and pine air freshener. And he would lift her up to the ceiling and tell her she was getting too big to throw, and then throw her anyway. She remembered his hands calloused and yellow at the fingertips from nicotine, and she remembered the way he hummed old country songs under his breath when he thought nobody was listening. She remembered him whole the way a child remembers in flashes of warmth without context. What she did not remember was the night he left. She was 6 years old. It was January of 2010, and the company had folded the week before Christmas. There had been talk in the kitchen for months, low voices over coffee that stopped when she walked into the room. Hollis had taken to drinking on the porch in the cold, smoking one cigarette after another. and watching the highway in the distance like he was waiting for something to come for him. On the last night, Loretta had cooked his favorite meal, country ham and biscuits and pinto beans with a little brown sugar in them. And he had pushed the food around on his plate and barely said 2 words. Della had gone to bed early. She remembered the heater making its little tick-tick sound as it cooled, and the sound of her parents talking in the next room. And then the sound of her father crying, which was a sound she had never heard before, and which frightened her more than any storm. She fell asleep listening to it. When she woke up in the morning, his boots were gone from the porch, and his coat was gone from the hook, and the keys to the pickup were gone from the bowl by the door. Loretta was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had not touched, looking out the window at the gray winter light. And when Della asked where Daddy was, her mother smiled the smile of a woman who has decided not to cry in front of her child. And she said he had gone to look for work and that he would be back when he could. He did not come back. There was no phone call. There was no letter. There was no forwarding address. There was only the slow understanding year by year that the man who had hummed her to sleep and thrown her at the ceiling had walked out of their lives, the way a tenant walks out of an apartment he is tired of paying rent on. Loretta never spoke a single word against him. Not once. When the other women at the truck stop whispered about no-good men and trash husbands, Loretta would just shake her head and pour more coffee. She told Della that her father had his reasons, even if those reasons belonged only to him, and that bitterness was a poison you swallowed hoping someone else would die from it. Della learned early not to ask. By the time she was 10 years old, the household had reached a place of quiet emergency. The trailer was leaking at the seams. The water heater had been replaced with a second-hand unit that ran cold by the 3rd minute of any shower. Loretta was working double shifts, and the dark circles under her eyes had become permanent fixtures. One evening in the fall, when Della came home from school, she found her mother at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills and a face like a woman trying not to drown. That was the night Della May stopped being a child. She did not tell her mother. She just went to school the next morning, and at lunch she walked across the parking lot to the truck stop and asked Otis Doyle if he had any work for a girl her size. Otis was a heavy man with a gray beard and eyes the color of weak tea, and he had known Loretta since before Della was born. He looked down at this skinny 10-year-old standing in his doorway with her chin set like a fence post, and he understood immediately what was happening. He did not say anything kind. Kind would have broken her. He just said the dishwasher had quit again last week and that if she wanted to scrub pots until her hands cracked, she could start that afternoon. She started that afternoon. She washed dishes after school 3 days a week. Her arms plunged to the elbows in scalding water, her small fingers learning the geometry of grease and burnt skillets. She earned $3 an hour under the table, which was illegal in every way. A thing could be illegal, but Otis paid her in cash at the end of each shift and slipped an extra $5 in her hand on Fridays and told her not to tell her mother. Della knew that her mother knew. Mothers always know. But Loretta said nothing because to say something would have meant admitting that she could not feed her own child alone. And that was an admission that would have broken something in her that she could not afford to break. This was the country no one wanted to put on television. The hidden America. The trailer park America. The America of laundromats with broken machines and clinics that were 40 minutes away, and fathers who left in the night without saying goodbye. Della Mae grew up inside that America, and she learned its rules the way other children learned multiplication tables. She learned that the rent was always due on the first. She learned that the propane truck would not deliver below a certain quantity. She learned that the food bank closed at 4 o'clock on Tuesdays and that you had to be in line by 3:30 if you wanted any of the meat. She learned that you do not cry over what cannot be helped, and that you do not complain to people who have less than you do, and that the only honest answer to the question, "How are you doing?" is the word "fine" delivered with a small smile, delivered the way her mother delivered it 10,000 times across the counter of Otis Doyle's truck stop. By the time she was 14, she had moved up from dishwashing to the register at a little convenience store at the edge of town. She worked from 6 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon before walking to the truck stop to help her mother stock the cooler in the back. She had not been to a full week of school in 3 years. Nobody from the school ever called. Nobody from the state ever knocked on the door. Girls like Della Mae were invisible in the way that the foundations of a building are invisible. Everyone walked on them. Nobody looked down. She was good at the work. That was the cruel and beautiful truth of it. She had her mother's hands and her mother's stamina, and she had inherited a kind of silent efficiency from somewhere deeper, somewhere older, somewhere she did not yet know to ask about. She could ring up a register transaction in under 12 seconds. She could fold a stack of T-shirts in the back room of the dollar store, with the corners square as a draftsman's plans. She could read a customer's face and know whether the conversation was going to be easy or hard before the man had said a single word. These were small skills, the kind of skills no one ever puts on a resume, but they were hers, and she had earned them. And then her mother died. It happened on a Tuesday in March of 2024. Loretta had worked a double shift the night before, gotten home at 4 in the morning, slept 3 hours and gone back to the truck stop for the breakfast rush because the other girl had called in sick. She finished her shift at 10:30. She drove home in the old Buick that wheezed up the gravel hill of Cherokee Park. She walked through the front door of the trailer and set her purse on the kitchen counter, the way she had set it down 10,000 times before. Then she sat down in the recliner in the living room, and she closed her eyes, and she did not open them again. Della found her at 3 in the afternoon. The death certificate said cardiac insufficiency. That was the medical phrase, the polite phrase, the phrase that allowed the county coroner to fill out his form and go home for dinner. The truth was that Loretta Crawford had been killed by 25 years of standing on her feet for 16 hours a day, by gas station coffee and microwave dinners and the constant low electrical hum of worry that had eaten her from the inside out. She was 41 years old. She had never taken a vacation. She had never owned a credit card. She had never spent a night in a hotel. She had raised her daughter alone in a single-wide trailer, and she had died in a recliner with the television on, and that was the whole story. Della did not scream when she found her. She did not collapse. She did not even cry, not right away. She walked across the room and turned off the television because it seemed obscene to let it keep talking. She sat down on the floor next to her mother's chair, and she took her mother's hand, which was still warm, and she held it for a long time. She watched her mother's face. She memorized it. She knew that this would be the last time she would see her mother's face up close, and she wanted to remember every line of it, every freckle, every silver thread in the auburn hair at the temples. She held that hand until it grew cool, and then she stood up and she called the ambulance, because that is what you are supposed to do, even when you know the ambulance is for paperwork now and not for help. The funeral was small. The plot was in the cheapest corner of the county cemetery under a stunted dogwood that had been struck by lightning the summer before. Della did not have the money for any of it. She did not have the money for the casket or the headstone or the small obituary in the local paper. She had $96 in her checking account and a maxed-out debit card and a name on a lease that the landlord was already eyeing. It was Otis Doyle who paid. He came to the trailer the day after Loretta died. He stood in the kitchen with his trucker's cap in his hand and his eyes red-rimmed in a way that surprised Della, because she had not known until that moment that Otis had loved her mother in his own quiet way for 20 years and had never once said it. He set an envelope on the counter. He did not look at her when he said the words. He said the cost was covered. He said she did not need to thank him. He said that if she wanted to pay him back, she could do it in pieces, $25 a month out of her paycheck at the convenience store. No interest, no contract, just an understanding between two people who had loved the same woman in different ways. Della tried to say something. He shook his head once. He put his cap back on and he walked out the door, and the screen door slammed behind him, the way it had slammed 10,000 times before. And that was that. She paid him back over 9 months. She lived on rice and beans and the day-old bread that the bakery threw out behind the dumpster at closing time. She wore the same 2 pairs of jeans on rotation, and she patched the knees with iron-on denim from the dollar store. She walked to work to save the gas in the Buick. Every payday she carried $25 in cash across the parking lot to the truck stop, and she set it on the counter, and Otis would nod once and slide it into the till, and neither of them would say a word about it. By the end of the 9th month, the debt was 0. She thought she would feel free. She did not feel free. She felt something stranger and more terrible. She felt unmoored. As long as that debt had existed, there had been one last thread connecting her to her mother. One last obligation. One last weekly act of remembrance. One last thing that linked the living daughter to the dead mother. And now the thread was cut. There was no one left who needed anything from her. There was no one left she owed anything to. There was no one left in the whole wide world who would notice if she walked out the door of her trailer and never came back. She found out 3 weeks later that the world had noticed in its own way. She came home from a double shift at the convenience store one cold November night. The trailer had a sheet of yellow paper taped to the door. She read it twice before she understood what it said. The landlord had sold the lot to a developer. The whole row of trailers was being cleared for a self-storage facility. Della Mae Crawford had 72 hours to vacate the premises. Her belongings would be considered abandoned property after that point, and disposed of accordingly. She did not cry. She walked inside. She made a cup of coffee with the last of the grounds. She sat down at the kitchen table and she looked around at the only home she had ever known. The wood paneling on the walls. The crooked photograph of her at 7 years old in her Easter dress. The kitchen clock that had been losing 2 minutes a day for as long as she could remember. The recliner in the corner where her mother had died. She took the photograph off the wall. She took her mother's ID card and Social Security card out of the desk drawer. She took the 2 pairs of jeans and the 4 t-shirts and the heavy coat that had been her father's once. She took a paperback copy of Charlotte's Web that her mother had read to her when she was little. She took the address book and she took the small wooden box that contained her mother's wedding ring, which had been bought from a pawn shop in 1995, and which was probably worth $80 if you knew what you were doing. Everything else she left. She walked out of the trailer at 5 in the morning. She did not look back. She walked down the gravel road of Cherokee Park with her backpack on her shoulders and the wind cutting through her father's old coat. And she kept walking until she reached the on-ramp of Interstate 40. And there she stopped and she counted the money in her pocket. $38. That was all she had. That was the total balance of 22 years of work and love and grief, the entire net worth of Della Mae Crawford, daughter of Loretta, granddaughter of nobody she had ever heard of. $38 and a backpack and a paperback and a wedding ring and the clothes on her back. She started walking east because east was where the sun was coming up, and she did not have a better reason than that. The 2 months that followed were the kind of months that no one writes home about. She drifted along the shoulder of the interstate by day and slept in bus shelters by night. She learned which truck stops would let a girl wash up in their bathrooms without asking questions. She learned that the rest area off exit 219 had a microwave in the vending area that could heat up a dollar store cup of noodles, and that the security guard there came on duty at 11 and went home at 7, and that if you were quiet and small and tucked in the corner behind the vending machines, you could pass for someone waiting on a ride. She perfected the art of disappearing. It was the only art she had ever studied. She learned to sit with a paperback open on her lap and a slightly bored expression on her face, the look of a girl waiting for her boyfriend to pick her up from his shift. She learned to wash her hair in a gas station sink with the little bar of motel soap she had stolen from a Days Inn dumpster. She learned to wear her hood up, but not too far up because hoods too far up made the bus drivers nervous. She learned to sleep sitting upright with her backpack chained to her wrist by a cheap luggage strap, because more than once she had woken up to find someone with their hand inside the front pocket. She ate from vending machines. She drank water from public restrooms. She rode Greyhound buses that smelled of diesel and stale cigarettes, and the slow despair of people who could not afford to fly. And she watched the towns roll past the rain-streaked windows like images in a book she would never own. Winston-Salem, Greensboro, Statesville, Hickory. She did not know where she was going. She was not going anywhere. She was just moving because to stop moving was to admit that she had nowhere to be, and that was a truth she was not ready to look at yet. By the end of the 2nd month, the move-in had begun to wear her down. The cold had set in. The first real snowfall of the season had come and gone, and she had spent the night of it in a bus shelter in a town she could not remember the name of, wrapped in her father's coat, with her arms around her knees and her teeth chattering so hard she thought she might crack a tooth. She had stopped feeling her fingers properly. She had stopped sleeping more than an hour or 2 at a stretch. There was a hollow place opening up in her chest, and she knew with the slow, clear knowledge of an animal that senses its own end that she could not keep going much longer. She did not want to die. That was the thing. She had never wanted to die. She wanted to stop, but stopping was its own kind of dying, and she did not yet know how to do one without the other. And then, on a gray Tuesday in late January, on a half-empty Greyhound bus, winding its way through the western edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, she heard two old men talking, and her life cracked open along a seam she had not known was there. She had been sitting near the back of the bus, in the second-to-last row by the window. Her forehead was pressed against the cold glass. The mountains rolled past in their winter colors, slate gray and rust brown, and the pale silver of bare oak branches against an iron sky. She was half asleep, the kind of half asleep where the engine vibration becomes the inside of your dreams. 2 rows ahead of her sat 2 men in their late 60s, dressed in the heavy canvas coats and faded flannel of working men, and they were talking over the diesel hum in the loud, careful way that older men talk when their hearing has started to go. They were loggers, or had been once. They were arguing about a county auction. The county was trying to clear out some old railroad equipment, they said, vestiges from when the Norfolk and Western line had run through these hollows in the days before the trucks took over. Most of it was scrap. Most of it was not worth the cost of hauling it out. But there was one lot in particular that the men were laughing about a lot, that the county had been trying to unload for years and could not seem to give away. It was a passenger car, a Pullman heavyweight from 1932, the kind of thing that used to run the night routes through the mountains back when train travel was still glamorous. 25 meters of steel and oak and brass abandoned on a dead siding deep in the woods, 4 miles from the nearest paved road. The county did not want to keep paying the property tax on something nobody could legally tow out without specialized equipment. So they were running it as the last lot in the next municipal auction with a starting bid of $10. Whoever paid the $10 would get the rail car and the deed to the small parcel of land it sat on and the rights to the 40 feet of dead rail it rested on. $10. Della heard the number and felt something in her chest stir, the way an old dog stirs when a familiar foot crosses a threshold. She did not move. She did not breathe louder. She just listened the way she had listened her whole life from the corners of rooms where no one knew she was paying attention. The 2 men were laughing now. They were saying the rail car was a fool's errand. The thing was rotted through, they said. The boiler in the floor was probably cracked. The roof leaked. There were probably raccoons living in the upholstery. It would take a crew with a helicopter to haul it out, and even then it would not be worth the fuel. Nobody had ever bid on the thing. They had been trying to sell it for years, and then one of the men, the heavier one with the bushy white mustache, leaned back in his seat and said something that made Della's blood stop in her veins. He said in a voice that carried the weight of old gossip and small-town memory that the rail car had once belonged to old Crawford, Elias Crawford, the one who had worked the Norfolk and Western line for 40 years and had died alone in his shack up in the holler back in '04. He said the old man had bought the car for some kind of pension settlement when the line shut down, and that he had spent the last years of his life out there with it, fixing it up, hauling things in and out. He said Elias Crawford had been the strangest man he had ever known. A man who came down to the village every Saturday morning, rain or shine, and sat in the diner with his coffee and never said 3 words to anybody. Just watched the road like he was waiting for somebody who never came. He said it was a shame the man had died with no kin to claim him. Della Mae Crawford sat in her seat by the window and did not move. Crawford. The name was on her birth certificate. The name was on her mother's death certificate. The name was on the lease that had been broken and the bills that had gone unpaid. The name was hers, and her mother's and her father's, and now it seemed the name of an old man in these very mountains who had spent his last years waiting on a road for someone who never came. She had never heard of Elias Crawford. Her mother had never spoken his name. Her father, in the 6 years she had known him, had never spoken his name. There were no photographs of grandparents in the trailer. There were no Christmas cards from elderly relatives. As far as Della had ever known, the Crawford family had begun with her father and ended with her like a tree that grows out of a crack in concrete and bears no fruit. But there had been a man, an old railroad man, same surname, in these mountains. The bus took the next exit. The two old men got off at a small village that sat in a hollow between two steep ridges, a place of stone houses and slate roofs and a single white church with a tin steeple. Della did not think. She did not weigh it. She did not run the numbers in her head about money or shelter or what came next. She stood up. She pulled her backpack down from the overhead rack. She walked down the aisle of the bus and stepped down into the cold air of a town she had never heard of. The sign at the edge of the road said, Ridgemont population 314. She stood on the sidewalk and watched the Greyhound pull away in a cloud of diesel exhaust. The two old men were already gone, swallowed up by the door of the diner across the square. The wind smelled of wood smoke and frozen pine. There was a courthouse on the square, an old red brick building with a white-painted cupola and a flagpole out front where a wind-tattered American flag whipped in the gray air. Della walked across the square and up the courthouse steps. She pushed open the heavy oak door. Inside, the air was warm and dry and smelled of floor polish and old paper. The light came from green-shaded lamps on tall wooden desks. Behind a single glass partition at the far end of the room sat a woman in her mid-50s with iron-gray hair pulled back in a low bun and reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, typing at a beige computer that was older than the girl standing in front of her. Della cleared her throat. She tried to keep her voice steady. She said she was here about the rail car. The woman looked up from her keyboard. She looked at Della for a long moment. She looked at the threadbare coat and the dirty backpack and the chapped lips and the way the girl stood like a young horse braced for a kick. The woman's face did not change exactly, but something passed behind her eyes. Some flicker of recognition that was not quite recognition. The way you sometimes feel when you walk into a room and know somehow that you have stood in that room before in a dream. The woman stood up slowly. She walked to the glass partition. She leaned forward and looked at Della more closely, the reading glasses slipping down her nose. She held the girl's gaze for so long that Della began to feel her face heat under the scrutiny. Then the woman spoke. Her voice was low and a little hoarse, the voice of a woman who had not expected to say these words today, who had perhaps been waiting to say them for a very long time, without knowing she was waiting. She said, "Child, you have his face." Della did not understand. She said the word, "What?" The woman did not answer. She turned back to her desk and she began to type with quick, certain strokes, her eyes flicking back and forth between the screen and the girl on the other side of the glass. She pulled open a wooden drawer behind her and rifled through a stack of manila folders. The kind with the red string and button closures, the kind that had not been used by any government office in 20 years. She pulled one out. She brought it to the partition. She set it down between them and she opened it. Inside was a deed. A photograph of the rail car from the 1970s faded to sepia at the corners. A handwritten will signed in a careful slanting script and notarized in 2003. A property tax statement showing 50 years of payments made in cash. A faded employee identification card from the Norfolk and Western Railway dated 1976, with a name typed in capital letters across the top. Elias Crawford. The man in the photograph on the ID card was looking straight into the camera with eyes the color of slate. His jaw was square, and his mouth was set in a hard line. He wore a blue work shirt and a railroad cap, and he had a small scar on his right cheekbone in the shape of a fishhook. Della had a scar on her right cheekbone in the shape of a fishhook. She had gotten it falling out of a tree when she was 8 years old. She put her hand against the glass to steady herself. The woman behind the partition said her name was Eleanor Whitmore. She said she had been the clerk of this office for 31 years. She said she had known Elias Crawford. She said the rail car had been listed for sale every year since 2004, and that in all that time only 3 people had ever come to inquire about it, and that every one of them had turned around and walked out the door once they understood the conditions. Della asked what the conditions were. Eleanor opened the folder to a typed page near the back. She turned it around so Della could read it. The will was very short. It said that Elias Crawford, being of sound mind, did hereby bequeath the rail car and the small parcel of land beneath it to any direct descendant of his bloodline who might one day come to claim it. It said the buyer must pay the symbolic sum of $10 to the county. And it said one more thing in a single sentence set off from the rest of the document by a careful underline drawn by the old man's own hand. The claimant must walk to the rail car alone. No vehicle, no companion. The journey must be made on foot from the village in a single day, without help. Della read the sentence 3 times. She looked up. She asked why. Eleanor Whitmore took off her reading glasses and folded them carefully on the counter. She looked at Della for a long moment, and her face had softened now into something that might have been pity, and might have been awe, and might have been something older than either of those words. She said she had asked Elias the same question once back in the late 90s, when he had brought the will into the office to have it filed. She said the old man had looked at her with those slate-gray eyes, and he had given the only answer he ever gave to a direct question, which was no answer at all. He had just said that anyone who was meant to find what he had left behind would understand the walk, and that anyone who was not meant to find it would not finish it. Eleanor said she had thought he was a strange old man. She said she had filed the will and thought she would never see it again. She said that no one in the Crawford family had come for the rail car in 50 years. She said that as far as she knew, Elias Crawford had died believing that his bloodline had ended with him. She said that whatever was inside that rail car, if there was anything inside it at all, had been waiting for someone who never seemed to be coming. Then she looked at Della Mae Crawford, 22 years old, with $38 in her pocket, and the wind of 2 months on her coat, and her grandfather's face under her own. She said, "Perhaps he was waiting for you." Della stood at the glass partition and felt the floor of her life tilt under her feet. The polished wood and the green lamps and the warm, dry smell of the courthouse seemed to recede from her like a tide pulling back from a shore. Somewhere far away she could hear the radiator clicking and the wind outside the windows, and her own heart pounding in the cage of her ribs. She thought of her mother in the recliner. She thought of her father's coat on her shoulders. She thought of an old man in these very mountains sitting in a diner every Saturday morning for 30 years watching a road for a son who was never coming back, never knowing he had a granddaughter who would have come if she had only known the way. She thought of the 72 hours and the eviction notice on the door. She thought of the snow in the bus shelter. She thought of the hollow place in her chest. Then, very slowly, she reached into the inside pocket of her coat. She pulled out a folded $10 bill, the last of her 38 sweat soft, and creased from 2 months of being carried against her ribs. She smoothed it out flat against the counter. She slid it through the slot at the bottom of the glass. Eleanor Whitmore looked down at the bill. She did not move for a long time. Then she opened her drawer and took out a stamp and a piece of carbon paper and a fountain pen. She filled in the deed in her careful, slanting hand. She pressed the seal of Ridgemont County into the soft red wax at the bottom of the page. She passed the deed back through the slot. She said the walk would take Della most of the afternoon. She said the trail was hard to find and harder to follow. She said the rail car sat in a clearing 4 miles into the national forest on a dead siding that had not seen a train in 50 years. She said the bridge over the French Broad was old, but it would hold. She said to follow the rails once she found them, and not to turn back no matter what she saw or heard along the way. Della folded the deed into the inside pocket of her coat. She picked up her backpack. She walked to the door. Eleanor Whitmore called her name just once as she reached for the handle. Della turned. The old clerk was standing behind her counter with her hands flat on the wood, and her eyes were wet behind her reading glasses, and she said the words slowly, as if she had been holding them in her mouth for a long time, and only just now found someone to say them to. She said, "Child, welcome home." Della Mae Crawford pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped out into the cold gray light of the afternoon. The wind off the mountains hit her in the face, and the smell of pine and wood smoke filled her lungs. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and looked down across the square at the road that led out of the village, the narrow blacktop that wound down into the hollow and disappeared into the trees. She did not know what was waiting for her at the end of that road. She did not know about the welded steel door or the cigar boxes lining the walls of a sealed compartment, or the pocket watch that was still ticking after 50 years, or the letters in a post office box that had been written to her since before she was born. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she was not running away from something. She was walking toward it. She tightened the straps of her backpack across her shoulders. She pulled the collar of her father's coat up around her neck. She walked down the courthouse steps and across the square, and she turned onto the road that led into the mountains, and she began to walk. The sun was sinking behind the western ridges. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the blacktop. Somewhere far ahead in a clearing that no one had visited in half a century, a Pullman heavyweight from 1932 sat silent and rusting under a canopy of bare oak, and the door at the back of its last compartment waited as it had waited for 50 years for the one who would walk alone. She walked into the trees and the village fell away behind her. and the road narrowed into a dirt track, and the dirt track narrowed into a path, and the path led down toward a stone viaduct that arched across a river singing in the cold. And beyond the river the forest closed over her head like a green and watchful cathedral. And she walked on. The viaduct came into view just as the last of the daylight began to fail behind the western ridge. It rose out of the trees like the bones of some forgotten giant. An old stone bridge of cut granite blocks, fitted together without mortar, its arches blackened by a century of moss and wood smoke and the slow, patient work of rain. 5 tall piers stood in the racing water of the French Broad, and the river boiled white between them, throwing up a fine cold mist that hung in the air and made the stones shine like wet bone. Della Mae Crawford stopped at the lip of the bridge and put one hand against the parapet and felt the vibration of the water coming up through the stone into the soles of her boots. She had never seen anything so old that was still standing. The viaduct had been built in 1908, though she did not know that yet. It had carried the Norfolk and Western line across the gorge for 66 years before the trains stopped running, and the rails on the far side were left to the woods. Now there was no railing where the tracks had been. The wooden ties had rotted away and fallen into the river below, and only the granite spine of the bridge remained 2 rust-eaten rails set into the stone, with iron spikes that had bled streaks of orange down the gray walls, like old wounds that had never fully closed. She did not let herself look down. She knew if she looked down she would lose her nerve. She set her eyes on the far end of the bridge, where the woods rose up dark and watchful, and she put one foot in front of the other, and she walked across. The wind funneled through the gorge and pushed at her like a hand. The river roared below. Her father's coat snapped at her knees. She walked the length of the viaduct, one slow, careful step at a time, her boots finding the iron of the rail beneath the snow. The bones of her grandfather's railroad carrying her over the water and into the country he had loved. When she stepped down off the far end of the bridge, she stopped and turned and looked back. The village was gone. The lights of Ridgemont had vanished behind the curve of the gorge. There was only the bridge and the river and the woods and the gray winter sky above. She had crossed over into a place that did not belong to anyone she had ever known. She turned and walked into the forest. The trail beyond the viaduct was barely a trail. Where the rails left the bridge, they ran into a wall of bare oak and rhododendron and the standing skeletons of last summer's Joe Pye weed, and within 20 paces the iron of the tracks was buried under a dense matting of leaves and pine needles and twisted blackberry cane. Della had to stop every few minutes to find the rail again, scraping with the toe of her boot at the leaf litter, until she felt the hard ridge of metal beneath. The ties were almost entirely gone. The few that remained were so soft with rot that they crumbled when she stepped on them, releasing a sour, woody smell of fungus and dampness and decades of forgotten weather. The forest was a different country from the village. The light here was older. The trees were older. Some of the chestnut stumps she walked past must have been 300 years old, their broken crowns gone to the blight a century ago, but their root systems still pushing up thin, hopeless saplings each spring. The hemlocks along the creek beds were dying too, eaten from the inside by an insect Della had never heard of. Their dead branches snapping off in the wind and crashing through the underbrush, with sounds that made her flinch. She walked for an hour and a half. The light got worse. She had been told by Eleanor Whitmore that the rail car sat 4 miles in, but 4 miles in this country was not the same as 4 miles on a highway. 4 miles in this country was a different unit of measure altogether. She climbed over deadfall the size of small houses. She forded a creek where the water was so cold it made her teeth ache. She tore the right knee of her jeans on a hawthorn that lashed out of the dark like a thing with intent. The cold began to creep in past her father's coat and settle in the small of her back and in the joints of her fingers. And she knew that if she did not reach the rail car before dark, she would have to spend the night in the open. And the night in the open would not be like a bus shelter on Interstate 40. The night in the open here would be something else. She kept walking. The forest around her was almost silent. There were no birds this deep into January. There was only the wind in the high branches and the occasional crack of cold splitting the trunk of a tree somewhere off in the distance. Once she heard the bark of a fox, a high, broken sound that did not belong to anything human. Once she thought she heard something large moving in the rhododendron off to her left. But when she stopped and held her breath, the sound stopped too, and she could not tell if it had been a bear or a deer or her own mind making weight out of shadows. Then the trees opened up. It happened the way it happens in old stories without any warning at all. One moment she was pushing through a stand of mountain laurel that closed over her head like a green tunnel, and the next moment she stepped out into a clearing the size of a small pasture, and the light of the dying afternoon fell across her shoulders, and she stopped where she stood and could not make her feet move forward. The rail car was there. It sat in the middle of the clearing on a short section of dead rail, 25 meters of old Pullman heavyweight, its long flanks running north and south. The paint had been the deep Tuscan red of the Norfolk and Western once, but 50 years of weather had reduced it to a patchwork of rust and faded pigment, and the pale silver of bare metal where the rust had eaten all the way through. The roof was streaked black with the runoff of decades. The brass handrails on the vestibule platforms were green with verdigris. The windows along the side were filmed with grime, and the few that were not broken reflected the gray sky back at her, like the eyes of a sleeping animal. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She did not know why. She could not have said why not in any way that would have made sense to another person. But there was something in the line of it, the long, low geometry of it, the way it sat there in the clearing as though it had grown out of the ground itself, that made her chest hurt in a way she had not felt since the afternoon she had sat on the floor next to her mother's chair and held her mother's cooling hand. It was the feeling of recognition. It was the feeling of coming home to a house you had never seen before and knowing the way to the bedroom in the dark. She walked across the clearing slowly. The ground crunched under her boots, frozen ferns and brittle nettle stalks, and a thin glaze of old snow. She walked the length of the car along the eastern side, running her gloved hand along the cold steel skin, feeling the rivets under her fingertips. The number above the doors had once been painted in gold leaf. She could still make it out under the grime. 4 digits. Pullman, 1932. At the south end of the car, she came to a small set of metal steps leading up to a vestibule platform and a heavy hinged door. The door had a brass handle shaped like a curved leaf. She climbed the steps. They groaned under her weight with the deep, tired sound of old iron. She put her hand on the brass handle and pulled. The door did not move. 50 years of rust and weather had welded the hinges into a single piece of corroded metal. She set her feet, took the handle in both hands, and put her whole weight against it. Nothing happened. She tried again. She tried until her shoulders burned and her breath came in short white clouds in the cold air. Then she stepped back, panting, and she did the only thing left to do. She turned around and went back down the steps and across the clearing to where a dead chestnut had fallen at the edge of the woods, and she rummaged through the deadfall until she found what she needed. A length of iron rod about 3 feet long, rusted but still solid. The kind of debris you find anywhere old industry has been. She climbed back up the steps. She wedged the iron rod into the crack between the door and the frame, and she pried. The door fought her for almost 10 minutes. Then something inside it gave with a long, shuddering groan, and the hinges broke loose from their 50-year sleep, and the door swung open with a scream of metal that echoed across the clearing and sent a single crow flapping in alarm from a high branch 100 yards away. Della stood on the threshold and looked into the dark. The air that came out of the rail car was a different air. It was colder than the air outside, and it was older, and it smelled of things she did not have names for. Cedar and brass polish and something deeper underneath the dry mineral smell of dust that has been undisturbed for half a century. It was the smell of a sealed room. It was the smell of time that has been kept. She stepped inside. The interior of the Pullman was a dim corridor running the length of the car, with small sleeping compartments opening off it on the right-hand side. The corridor was paneled floor to ceiling in dark wood. Della reached up and ran her glove along it, and the dust came away in a thick gray smear. And underneath the dust, the wood was the deep red-brown of mahogany with grain-like flowing water. The floor was a herringbone parquet of solid oak, scuffed and dulled by 10,000 vanished feet, but still whole, still hard, still the work of a man who had built things to last. The light came in through the windows on the western side, slanting down through the dust in long, pale columns. She walked slowly along the corridor and looked into each compartment as she passed. The first one had 2 facing bench seats upholstered in faded green velvet, with a little folding table between them and a brass reading lamp on the wall. The second had been a sleeping berth with a fold-down bunk and a small white porcelain wash basin mounted under the window. The basin was cracked. The mirror above it had silvered over with age until a reflection was only a pale ghost. She kept walking. There were 6 compartments along the corridor. Each one was a small, perfect time capsule of 1932, dust-thick and silent and waiting. In the 5th compartment, she found something that stopped her for a long moment. On the little folding table, set down as though its owner had only just stepped out for a smoke, was an enameled coffee cup, brown with rust around the rim. The cup was empty but for a fine layer of dust. Beside it lay a folded newspaper, the paper yellow and brittle as old leaves. She bent close. She could just make out the date in the top corner, July 14th, 1974. The day the Norfolk and Western had run its last train through these hollows. The day 52 years ago when her grandfather had walked off the line for the last time, gone to the auction house in Asheville with his pension settlement folded in his coat pocket, and bought himself a piece of the railroad he had given his life to. She stood there in the dim corridor and looked at the coffee cup and the folded newspaper, and she understood that she was standing in a room where her grandfather had spent the last morning of his working life. She understood that the cup had been his cup. The newspaper had been his newspaper. The bench seat where he had set the cup down had been his bench seat. He had drunk his coffee here on the morning of his last run, and he had folded his newspaper, and he had stood up and walked out, and the cup had sat there for 52 years waiting for someone to come back for it. She did not touch the cup. It felt wrong to touch the cup. She walked on. The corridor came to an end at the rear of the car. There should have been another vestibule platform here, another door leading out onto the back of the train, the way there had been at the front. There was not. Where the rear door should have been, there was instead something Della Mae Crawford had never seen on any passenger train, and which did not belong on a passenger train, and which made every small hair on the back of her neck stand up. It was a wall of welded steel, heavy industrial plate 1/2 inch thick, set into the original frame of the rail car, and sealed all the way around the edges with thick, black welds that had run and pooled and hardened decades ago. There was no handle. There was no window. There was no decoration. There was only a single massive deadbolt set into the center of the plate, the kind of bolt that goes on the door of a meat locker or a bank vault. And there was something else. Something Della did not see right away, because the light in the corridor was so dim and the steel was so dark. When she finally saw it, she had to bring her face very close, and even then she had to take her glove off and run her bare fingers across the metal to be sure. Words had been chiseled into the steel. They were rough words made with a hand chisel, and a hammer the letters uneven and crowded together at the end, as though the man who had cut them had been afraid of running out of room. They ran in a single line across the door at the level of her eyes. She traced each letter with her fingertip in the dimness, and the cold steel bit at her bare skin, and the words assembled themselves out of the dark one by one. For the one who walks alone. And then, below it, smaller, almost an afterthought, EC 1976. Della put her forehead against the steel and closed her eyes. He had known. Somehow, 50 years ago, a man she had never met had known that one day in a future, he would not live to see someone of his blood would walk out of the dying woods alone, and would push open the door of his rail car, and would walk down this corridor in the failing light, and would stand here at the end of it. He had cut those words for her, or for someone like her, someone who would come the way he had asked them to come, someone who would understand the conditions of the walk, even when no one would explain why. She did not understand, not yet. But she did not need to understand to feel the weight of it. The slow, vast weight of a stranger's love, reaching across half a century to find her where she stood. She stepped back. She looked at the deadbolt. The bolt was thrown. Whatever was on the other side of that door had been locked away with a deliberation that was almost frightening in its thoroughness. The hinges she saw now were on the outside. That was the only mercy. Whoever had welded this barricade had made one small error, or perhaps had made one small concession to the future. The hinges, 3 of them, were bolted to the frame on her side of the wall. She could break the hinges off. She went back outside. The light was failing fast now, the sun gone behind the ridge, the clearing settling into the blue half-light of a winter dusk. She moved quickly. She found a heavy fist-sized stone in the rubble at the edge of the rail bed, and she found a length of rebar that had been driven into the ground as a survey marker decades ago and was now half-eaten with rust. She brought both back inside. She went to work on the hinges. The work was brutal and long. She had no tools that any tradesman would have recognized. She had a piece of iron rod and a stone, and her own thin 22-year-old arms, and she had the will of a girl who had walked 4 miles into the wilderness with the last $10 of her life. She set the tip of the rebar against the bottom of the first hinge pin. She raised the stone in both hands. She brought it down. The clang of steel on steel was enormous in the silence of the corridor. The mahogany walls threw the sound back at her until the inside of the rail car rang like the inside of a bell. She struck again. She struck again. The hinge pin did not move. She adjusted the angle of the rebar and struck again. Sparks jumped. The skin on her palms cracked open, and she did not notice. She struck and struck and struck, and after what might have been 20 minutes, the first hinge pin began to move a 1/16 of an inch, then another 1/16, then a 1/4 inch, and then with a sudden scream of long rusted metal, the bottom pin shot free of the hinge and rang on the parquet floor like a coin dropped into a well. She did not pause. She moved up to the middle hinge. She set the rebar. She raised the stone. The work took her almost 2 full hours. By the time she was done, she had 3 hinge pins on the floor at her feet, and her shoulders were on fire, and her hands were bleeding inside her gloves, and the light in the rail car had failed to almost nothing. She set the stone down on the corridor floor. She wedged the rebar into the gap at the side of the door and put her shoulder against it. The plate of welded steel groaned. For one long moment, she thought she would not be strong enough. She was a small girl, and she had not eaten a real meal in 3 days, and the door weighed what it weighed. But she set her teeth, and she leaned her whole weight into the rebar, and she gave the inside of her chest a single word, and the word was please. The door let go. It did not swing. It fell. The whole half-ton sheet of welded steel pivoted on the remaining edges of the welds and toppled inward into the dark space beyond, and it hit the floor of the compartment with a sound that was not a sound so much as a physical pressure, a great soft boom that she felt in the bones of her face. Dust exploded up in a thick white wave. The corridor behind her filled with it. She coughed once hard and turned her head away and waited for the air to clear. When she looked again, she was looking into a room that no one alive had seen for 50 years. She could not see well. The compartment was almost completely dark. She understood why almost at once. Every window in this back compartment had been blocked. Not curtained, not boarded over. Welded shut from the inside with the same heavy plate of black steel that had sealed the door. The only light in the room was the dim gray afterlight that came through the corridor behind her, and that light fell only a few feet into the compartment before the dark swallowed it. She fumbled in her pocket for her phone. The battery was at 14%. She had been saving it. She turned on the flashlight and pointed it into the dark. The beam swept across the room. It caught wood. Shelves. Wood shelves running floor to ceiling along both walls, and across the back wall too. 3 walls of shelves built of rough planed pine. The lumber dark with age, but solid. the shelves themselves spaced perhaps 10 inches apart. The beam swept across them, and what was on them caught the light, and Della Mae Crawford forgot how to breathe. The shelves were packed with boxes. They were cedar boxes, cigar boxes, the kind that had been common 100 years ago, the kind that men kept on their dressers for tobacco and keepsakes. Each box was perhaps 8 inches long and 4 inches deep, with a hinged lid and a small brass clasp. The boxes were stacked in neat, orderly rows from the floor to the ceiling, and the rows ran the entire length of 3 walls. Della tried to count and gave up almost at once. There were dozens. There were many dozens. There might have been 100. There might have been more. She walked into the compartment. The floor under her boots was the same herringbone oak as the corridor. But here there was no dust, or almost no dust. The compartment had been sealed too well. No outside air had reached this room in 50 years. The cedar boxes had perfumed the air with a faint, dry sweetness that was almost the smell of incense in a very old church. She reached out with her bleeding hand and lifted down the nearest box. It was heavier than it looked. She sat down cross-legged on the floor. The light from her phone made a small pool around her. She set the cigar box on her lap, and she opened the clasp. Inside, packed so tightly that they could not move, were paper banknotes, thick stacks of them bound with rubber bands that had long since rotted into brittle brown ribbons. Della touched one stack with her fingertip, and the rubber band crumbled to dust. The bills underneath were as crisp as the day they had been printed. They were old bills, United States notes, red seals, $20 bills with the portrait of Jackson. She lifted one stack carefully. She counted. She lost count and counted again. The stack was 100 bills. The box had perhaps 20 stacks in it. $40,000 in one box. She closed it. She set it on the floor beside her. She reached up for another box. This one rattled when she lifted it. She opened it. It was full of silver dollars, Morgan dollars. Hundreds of them, layer on layer, the soft pewter glow of old silver coming up at her in the beam of the flashlight. Some of them were so well preserved that the eagle on the back still gleamed. She closed the box. She set it down. She reached up for another. The third box was smaller than the others, and it was lined with red velvet. The velvet now faded almost to brown. Nestled in pockets of the velvet were coins of a different color, a deep, warm yellow that did not change as she moved the flashlight across them. Gold pieces. $20 pieces. She picked one up. St. Gaudens Double Eagle. The Standing Liberty walked across the face of the coin with her torch raised. Della had seen one of these in a magazine once. She had read that they were worth thousands of dollars apiece in any condition, and far more in mint condition. This box had perhaps 30 of them. She closed the box. She set it down. She sat on the floor of the compartment in the dim pool of her phone's flashlight, with 3 open cigar boxes around her on the parquet. And she looked up at the shelves, and the shelves and the shelves of unopened boxes, climbing into the dark above her head. She tried to do the math. She could not do the math. The math was too big. She was a girl who had been counting $25 payments to Otis Doyle for 9 months, and she was sitting in the middle of a treasure room in the woods, and there was no mathematics in her body that could hold what she was looking at. She put her face in her hands, and she stayed that way for a long time. She did not cry. She had not cried when her mother died, and she had not cried in the bus shelter in the snow, and she did not cry now. There was a place inside her where the crying was kept, and it was a deep place, and she had learned in 22 years that it could not be opened without breaking something else open along with it. She held herself together with the strength she had been given by Loretta Crawford, who had stood on her feet for 16 hours a day for 25 years and had never once let her daughter see her break. When Della finally lifted her head, the flashlight on her phone was getting dim. She had 10% battery left. The dark in the compartment had grown thicker. She made herself stand up. Her knees creaked. The cold of the floor had gone into her bones. She moved the flashlight slowly along the shelves to see what else there might be in the room, because she did not believe yet that the boxes were the whole of it. She did not believe that a man would seal a door with welded steel, only to leave money inside. There had to be more. There was always more. The beam of the flashlight reached the bottom shelf on the back wall and stopped. There was something behind the last row of cigar boxes. Something that did not match the other boxes. Something metal. She crossed the compartment. She knelt down. She pushed the cigar boxes aside and she reached behind them, and her fingers closed on the cold, curved surface of an old workman's lunch tin. White enamel, scratched and chipped, and rust-pocked, with a little hinged lid and a tiny iron latch. The kind of tin that a railroad man would have carried his cornbread and ham in back when he climbed into the cab of a steam locomotive at 4 a.m, with the cold still on him. She brought the tin out into the pool of her flashlight. She sat down on the floor again, and she set the tin on her knees, and she opened the latch with her thumb. There was no money inside. There was a single envelope. The paper was yellow at the corners. The flap had been tucked, never sealed. Inside the envelope was a photograph and a folded letter. She took the photograph out first. It was a black and white print, the edges crinkled, the corners soft. It showed a man standing in front of the rail car in what must have been the early 1970s, before the welded plate had been put up and the windows blocked. The paint on the car was bright and new. The brass was polished. The man was perhaps 60 years old. He wore the blue work shirt and the dark canvas trousers and the engineer's cap of a railroad man, and his hand was resting on the side of the car, the way a man rests his hand on the flank of a horse he has owned for a long time. His face was the face on the ID card Eleanor Whitmore had shown her in the courthouse. The slate gray eyes, the square jaw, the fishhook scar on the right cheekbone. Her grandfather. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She had never seen his face before today, and now she had seen it twice. And the second time was harder than the first. He was alive in this photograph. He was breathing. The hand on the side of the car was the hand that had cut the words in the steel. She set the photograph aside. She unfolded the letter. The handwriting was the same slanting, careful script that had been on the will at the courthouse. The ink was old and a little faded, but every word was legible. The letter was not long. It filled most of one side of a single sheet of lined paper torn from a notebook. There was no date. There was no salutation. He had written the way a man writes who is not sure who will read what he is writing, but who is determined to leave the words behind for whoever comes. My name is Elias Crawford. I worked for the Norfolk and Western Railway from the spring of 1954 to the summer of 1994. 40 years. I started on the steam engines and I ended on the diesel electrics. When the line shut down in '74, they gave me a settlement, and I bought this car at the auction in Asheville. I have lived on it ever since. I do not trust banks. My father lost everything to the banks in '29. I have not put $1 of my own money into a bank since the day I came home from the Pacific. What you see in this room is the work of my life. It is honest money. Every bill in these boxes was earned by my 2 hands. The silver and the gold I bought a little at a time over the years when I could afford it. I bought them because I did not want my work to be eaten by inflation, the way my father's work was eaten by the crash. I had a son. His name was Hollis. He was 25 years old in the spring of 1995, and he came to me one evening at the rail car, and he asked me for money. I do not know what he needed it for. I do not know what trouble he was in. I gave him $5,000 in cash from these boxes, and I told him to make it last, and to come back to me if it was not enough. He took the money. He did not come back. He left the village in the night, and I did not see him again. I tried for 2 years to find him. I could not. If you are reading this letter, then you are my blood. I do not know your name. I do not know if you are a man or a woman. I do not know if my son ever spoke of me to you, or if you are coming to this rail car without any idea of who I was. It does not matter. What is here is yours. Take it. Use it. Live a life with it. I cut the door shut so that no stranger would find what I had set aside for my own. I made the walk a hard one so that whoever came would come with the heart of a Crawford, which is the heart of a person who is willing to walk alone towards something they cannot see. I have waited for you for a long time. If I am dead by the time you read this, do not grieve for me. I have had a long life, and I have done my work, and I have nothing left to give except what is in this room. Take it and go and be well. I never stopped thinking of you. Your grandfather, Elias Crawford. Della read the letter once. She read it a second time. She read it a third time, and on the third reading her hands began to tremble so badly that she had to set the paper down on the floor in front of her. Her father's name. Her father's name was Hollis. She had not told a single person on the road about her father. The letter knew her father's name. In the spring of 1995, her father, the man whose coat she was wearing right now, had walked up the long path through these woods to a rail car in a clearing and asked an old man for $5,000 in cash. The old man had been her grandfather. The $5,000 had been earned over 40 years of railroad labor. Her father had taken the money and walked away into the night and had never come back. 6 years later, he had appeared in Asheville, met Loretta at a roadhouse on the highway, married her under a false story about an estranged family up in Tennessee, and had given Della Mae Crawford his name and his blood and his face. Then he had left her too. He had run from this place. He had run from this man. He had carried the secret of Elias Crawford all the way to Cherokee Park, and he had taken the secret with him into whatever dark he had vanished into. and he had let his own daughter grow up believing she had no grandparents at all. Della picked up the letter again. She held it against her chest. She bent forward over her knees and the dim light of her phone went out, and she sat in the dark of the sealed compartment with her grandfather's words pressed to her ribs. She did not cry. There was still no crying in her. There was something larger than crying. There was a great wide silence, the silence of a person who has just been told something they have been waiting 22 years to hear. Without knowing they were waiting. Outside the rail car, the last of the daylight bled out of the clearing. The cold deepened. The wind moved through the bare oaks and made a long, low sigh in the highest branches. Somewhere off in the dark, a great horned owl called once, twice, 3 times, and then the woods were silent again. Della stayed where she was for a long time. She did not know how long. The phone went completely dead. The compartment around her was now the most absolute dark she had ever experienced, the dark of a sealed room with all the windows welded over a dark that did not lighten, no matter how long her eyes adjusted, because there was simply no light to adjust to. She sat in it and she let it hold her. There was nothing frightening about it. The dark was kind in its way. The dark was her grandfather's, and the dark had been waiting for her, and the dark had welcomed her in. Eventually she stirred. She did not know what time it was. She did not know how she would get out of the woods in the dark. She did not know what came next. She knew only that she had been here long enough, and that she needed to feel the air of the corridor on her face, and that she needed to lie down somewhere warmer than the floor of the sealed room. She put the letter back in the envelope. She put the envelope and the photograph back in the enamel tin. She closed the latch. She held the tin against her chest with both arms, and she stood up in the dark, and she felt her way back through the empty doorway and into the corridor of the rail car. The corridor was a little less dark than the compartment. A faint grayness came in through the western windows, the last reflected light from a sky that had no moon yet, but had not gone completely black. Della stood in the corridor and waited for her eyes to come back to her. She walked slowly along the parquet, one hand trailing on the mahogany wall, until she reached the 5th compartment, the one with the coffee cup and the folded newspaper from the morning of July 14th, 1974. She went inside. She sat down on the bench seat opposite the one where the cup had been set down 52 years ago. She drew her knees up to her chest. She wrapped her father's coat around her like a blanket. She held the enamel tin to her body, the way a child holds a stuffed animal in the dark. She closed her eyes. She did not mean to sleep. She thought she would only rest. But she had walked 4 miles into the wilderness on an empty stomach, and she had pried apart a sealed steel door with a piece of rebar and her own bones, and she had read a letter that had rearranged the entire map of her life. The body has its own laws. Sleep came down on her like a slow, heavy snow, and within minutes she was gone. Her cheek pressed against the green velvet of the bench, her breath fogging the cold air in front of her face. The tin cradled against her chest. She slept the dreamless sleep of a person who has finally arrived somewhere. Outside in the clearing, the night came down over the Pullman heavyweight, and the silent shelves of cigar boxes, and the girl who had walked alone into the forest with $10 and walked out somehow with everything. But not yet. Because back in the sealed compartment on the highest shelf at the very back wall in a corner, The flashlight had not quite reached. There was something Della had not yet seen. Something that had been making all this long afternoon a sound so faint that she had not been able to hear it over the pounding of her own heart, and the hammering of iron and the breathing of her own grief, her own. It was a sound that did not belong in a room that had been sealed for 50 years. It was a sound that should not have been possible. It was the small, soft, steady, perfectly maintained sound of a pocket watch. Ticking. She woke to a thin gray light and the cold pressure of the enamel tin against her ribs. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The smell was wrong. The smell was cedar and old varnish and something faintly metallic, and there was no engine hum and no diesel, and no fluorescent buzz from the cooler at the convenience store. Then she opened her eyes and saw the green velvet of the bench seat under her cheek, and the mahogany paneling of the compartment wall, and the small folding table where her grandfather's coffee cup had sat for 52 years. And she remembered. She sat up slowly. Every muscle in her body had a complaint. Her shoulders had locked overnight. Her right hand had stiffened around the latch of the tin. The skin of her palms was crusted with dried blood inside her gloves, and when she flexed her fingers, the cracks opened up again and stung. The light coming in through the dust-filmed window had the pale silver quality of the hour just after dawn. She had slept for almost 12 hours. She did not remember any of it. There had been no dreams or none she could recall. Only the long, blank dark of a person who has been carrying too much weight for too long and has finally been allowed to set it down. She stood up. Her knees creaked. She held the enamel tin in one hand, and she walked out into the corridor of the Pullman. The light in the corridor was better now. The eastern windows took the morning sun and cast long, pale rectangles across the parquet floor. The dust in the air drifted and turned in the light. Della walked slowly back along the corridor toward the rear of the car, toward the compartment with the welded door now lying flat on the floor inside it. And at the threshold, she stopped. In the daylight, she could see the room properly for the first time. The cigar boxes climbed the 3 walls in their patient ranks. The cedar was the color of old honey where the dust had been disturbed. The room smelled sweet and dry and faintly of metal, and the metal smell she realized now was not the smell of the coins. It was the smell of an old clock, a pocket watch. She heard it before she found it. She had not heard it the night before, because her own heart had been beating too loudly, and because the wind outside had been moving in the high branches. But now in the dawn silence with the air still, and her body rested, she heard it clearly. A small, soft, perfectly regular sound. Tick, tick, tick. The patient measured speech of a mechanism that had been wound and rewound for decades by a hand that knew exactly how to wind it. She followed the sound with her ears. It came from the highest shelf at the back wall in the corner. Her flashlight had not quite reached. She had to drag the welded steel plate aside to get to it, the metal scraping on the parquet, and she had to climb up on the lowest shelf to reach the highest one. She stood on her toes. She reached into the corner. Her fingers closed on a chain. She brought it down carefully. It was a railroad pocket watch. The case was solid silver, scratched and dimmed by years of being carried in a workman's pocket, but still unmistakably fine. On the face, in clear black letters, the words Norfolk and Western Railway were arranged in a small arc above the central spindle. Below them, in smaller letters, the word Standard. The hands moved. The second hand swept its way around the face in the slow, steady arc that watch hands have always made. Della read the time. It was 7:18 in the morning. She held the watch in her palm and felt the small mechanical vibration of it. A pocket watch needed to be wound. A pocket watch wound to the maximum would run perhaps 30 hours, maybe 36, in a very good one. After that, the spring would slack and the hands would stop. This watch was running, which meant that someone had wound it within the last day and a half. She stood there for a long time with the watch in her hand and the sealed room around her, and she felt something cold move down the back of her neck. The compartment was a tomb. The compartment had been welded shut for 50 years. She had broken in herself 12 hours ago with her own hands and a piece of rebar. No one else had been in this room. No one else could have been in this room. But the watch was running. She turned the watch over. On the back of the case, engraved in a careful, old-fashioned script, were 2 lines of words. To Elias Crawford, for 40 years of honest service, Norfolk and Western Railway, June 1994, his retirement watch. The watch they had given him on his last day. The watch he must have carried for the last 10 years of his life until the day he died in 2004, alone in this rail car in the woods. And then someone had taken the watch off his body and put it on this high shelf in the sealed room. And someone had been winding it ever since. She did not understand. Not yet. But she understood that she was not as alone in this clearing as she had thought. She put the watch carefully into the inside pocket of her coat, next to the deed and the letter, and the enamel tin. She walked back along the corridor of the Pullman. She pushed open the vestibule door at the south end of the car, which now hung crooked on the broken hinges she had pried apart yesterday, and she stepped out onto the platform and down into the clearing. The morning was cold and clear. A thin frost lay on the dead ferns. The eastern sky was the color of beaten brass. There were no footprints in the frost around the rail car, except her own from the day before. But the frost was thin and it had been windy in the night, and a person who knew the woods could have come and gone in the dark without leaving anything that would last till sunrise. She stood in the clearing and looked at the trees. The trees gave her nothing back. She turned and started walking down the rail bed toward the viaduct. The walk back to Ridgemont took her 3 hours. The light was full when she reached the bridge. The river below the viaduct was running fast and silver in the cold morning. She crossed without looking down. On the far side, she walked up the dirt track to where it became the asphalt road, and the asphalt road led her down the long curve into the village, and at the bottom of the curve she could see the white steeple of the church, and the red brick of the courthouse, and the small huddle of stone houses around the square, and the smoke of breakfast fires going up from a dozen chimneys into the still cold air. She did not go to the courthouse first. She went to the diner. The diner was on the south side of the square, a narrow place with a long counter and 6 booths and a hand-lettered sign in the window that said, "Biscuits and gravy, $3.75. Della had not eaten a hot meal in 11 days. She had $10 left in the world. No, that was wrong. She had no dollars left at all. The last $10 were folded into Eleanor Whitmore's drawer at the courthouse, written down in a county ledger as the sale price of an old rail car. She walked into the diner anyway. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 45, with her hair tied back in a red bandana and a coffee pot in her hand. She looked up when the bell over the door rang, and she looked at Della Mae Crawford, and her face went still in the way that Eleanor Whitmore's face had gone still the day before. She said nothing. She just walked around the counter and led Della to a booth by the window and set down a mug and poured it full of black coffee. She set down a plate of biscuits and gravy that Della had not ordered. She set down a glass of orange juice. She looked at Della one more time, and her eyes were soft and a little wet, and she walked away to the kitchen without saying a single word. Della did not understand. She would not understand for another hour. She ate slowly. She had learned on the road that a stomach starved for a week does not take food well, and she made herself chew each bite 20 times the way the woman at the homeless shelter in Statesville had taught her. The coffee burned the cracks in her lips. The biscuit was the best thing she had ever tasted. She was halfway through the second biscuit when the bell over the door rang again, and Eleanor Whitmore came in. Eleanor crossed to the booth and sat down across from her. The older woman was wearing a wool overcoat the color of dark wine, and her gray hair was pinned up under a knit cap, and she had a cardboard envelope tucked under her arm. She set the envelope on the table between them. She looked at Della with the same expression the woman behind the counter had worn, the soft, wet eyes, the small, careful smile. Eleanor said, "You came back." Della said, "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor said, "Norma Jean at the counter telephoned me when you walked in. The whole village has been watching for you since yesterday afternoon." Della did not know what to say to this. She looked down at her plate. Eleanor laid her hand flat on the table the way an older person does when she wants to steady a conversation. Eleanor said, "Child, there is someone who would like to meet you. He has been waiting a very long time. May I ask him to come and sit with us?" Della said, "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor stood up. She walked to the door of the diner, and she opened it, and she called out across the square in a voice that was much louder than her speaking voice, the voice of a woman who had grown up in a place where you called people in from a porch when supper was ready. She called a name. The name was Wilbur. A man crossed the square. He came slowly with the careful step of someone in his late 70s whose knees did not love him anymore. He wore a heavy gray wool coat and a brown felt hat and a red plaid scarf tucked into the collar, and he carried a small bunch of dried mountain laurel in one hand, the way a man carries a hat at a funeral. His face was long and weathered and clean-shaven. His eyes were the pale blue of a winter sky. He came into the diner. He took off his hat. He stood beside the booth for a moment without speaking, looking down at Della, and his eyes were doing the same thing. The eyes of every old person in this village had done since she walked into Ridgemont, which was the slow, grateful work of finding a face they had been waiting to see. He said her name as though he had said it many times before, alone in his own house in the dark. He said, "Della Mae." She nodded. She could not make her voice work. He set the dried laurel down on the corner of the table. He pulled out the chair across from Eleanor, and he sat down slowly. He folded his hands on the table. The hands were enormous and knobbed with arthritis, the knuckles like walnut shells, the back spotted with the brown freckles of long years. He looked at her for a long time. He said, "My name is Wilbur Hadley. I worked the line with your grandfather for 38 years. The bell over the door rang. Norma Jean came over and set a mug of coffee in front of Wilbur without being asked. She filled his cup. She looked at Della and at Wilbur and at Eleanor, and her eyes were wet too. And she went back to the counter without speaking. Wilbur Hadley wrapped his hands around the coffee mug. He breathed in the steam. He did not lift the cup yet. He had the bearing of a man who was about to say something he had rehearsed many times and was still afraid he would not get right. He said, "Your grandfather and I came on with the Norfolk and Western in '54. I was 18. He was 20. We started in the yard at Roanoke shoveling coal, and we worked our way up through every job a man can do on a railroad. I made conductor in '71. Elias made engineer in '73. We were both on the last run of this line on the 14th of July, 1974. He was at the throttle. I was in the rear car. When the train pulled into Asheville that night, we shook hands on the platform, and we did not let go for a long time." He took a slow breath. The steam from the coffee rose between them. He said, "Your grandfather was the best man I ever knew. He was the best man I am ever gonna know." He lifted the mug and took a small, careful sip. He set the mug back down. He looked at Della. He said when the line shut down, he took his settlement and he bought that car at the auction. He hauled it up onto the dead siding in the holler, and he made his home in it. I helped him do the welds in '76. He had me come up to the clearing with a portable rig from the rail yard at Asheville. He told me he wanted to seal a compartment in the back. He told me he wanted it sealed for 50 years. He did not tell me why, and I did not ask. A man like Elias Crawford did not have to give his reasons. Wilbur paused. He looked down at his hands. He said, "Your father came to the rail car in '95. I do not know what passed between them. I know that something did because Elias was never the same man after. He stopped coming to the diner on Saturdays for a year. He stopped speaking when he did come. The light went out of him. He waited at the rail car for Hollis to come back. Hollis did not come back. After about 2 years, Elias started writing. He looked up at her. He said he wrote every day. I do not mean once a week. I mean every day. He wrote in a notebook in the rail car in the mornings, and he carried the pages down to the post office in the village every Saturday, and he rented a box there, and he put what he had written into the box. He paid the rent on that box every year for the rest of his life. He told me one time, he said, "Wilbur, if I cannot have the boy back, I will write to whoever the boy makes. I will write to them every day of my life. And if they never come for what I have written, then it will not matter because the writing of it has been the company I have left." Della had stopped breathing. "Wilbur said he wrote to you for 9 years. He did not know your name. He did not know your face. He did not know if you would be a boy or a girl. He only knew that his son had been the kind of man who breaks a father's heart and walks away, and that men like that usually leave behind children who never know what they came from. He wrote to that child. He wrote to you." Della's hand had begun to shake on the handle of her coffee cup. She set it down. The cup made a small sound against the saucer. Wilbur reached into the inside pocket of his wool coat and brought out a small brass key on a leather thong. He set the key on the table between them. The key was heavy and old, and the leather of the thong was darkened with the oil of a hand that had carried it for many years. He said, "This is the key to Box 47 in the post office across the square. The rent is paid up through next December. I have been paying it for 22 years. Eleanor Whitmore was crying silently, her napkin pressed to her mouth. Della had not noticed. Norma Jean had come to the edge of the counter and was holding the coffee pot with both hands, watching her face still as a photograph. Wilbur was not finished. He said when your grandfather got sick in the winter of 2004, he sent for me. I went up to the rail car. He had been alone up there with the cold for 3 weeks, and he was past the time for a doctor. He knew it. He had me sit on the bench in the corridor and he asked me one thing. He asked me to keep watch over the rail car after he was gone. Not to disturb anything inside it. Not to tell anyone what was in it. Just to come up every Sunday and walk through it and wind the pocket watch on the high shelf and put a flower on the bench and make sure the roof had not given way. He said, "Wilbur, somebody is going to come for what I have left, and I do not know when and I do not know who, but somebody is going to come. And when they come, I want them to know that the place was loved. I do not want them to walk into a tomb." Wilbur stopped. He had to stop. His pale blue eyes had gone wet, and he was looking past Della at the window of the diner, at the square outside, at a 50-year picture that only he could see. He said I gave him my word. He pressed the heel of his hand into his eye for a moment. He said he died that night. I sat with him until the morning. I went down to the village and got the doctor and the deputy, and we did what had to be done. I buried him next to his wife in the cemetery on the hill west of the church. There were 5 people at the funeral. I have gone up to that rail car every Sunday for 22 years. There has not been a Sunday I missed. Not for snow, not for sickness, not for anything. I wound the watch. I dusted the shelves. I left a flower. I told him on his birthday every year that the child had not come yet, but that I was still looking. He looked at Della directly now. He said yesterday at 4:30 in the afternoon, Eleanor telephoned me at my house, and she told me a girl had come into the courthouse and put down $10 for the rail car. She told me the girl had Elias's face. I sat in my kitchen for an hour, and I cried like a child. Then I went up there. I wound the watch one last time on my way past. I did not go in. I did not want to disturb you. I knew you would be coming back down today. I put the laurel by the door. I left the note. Della heard the words from very far away. The note. "Welcome home, child." He waited every Sunday. The handwriting on the small folded paper on the threshold of the rail car that morning. She had not mentioned the note. She had not told anyone about the note. He had known she would find it, because he had put it there himself. She picked up the key. It was warm from being in his coat pocket. The brass was the color of old butter. She held it in her closed fist on the table, and she looked at Wilbur Hadley across the booth, and she said the first words she had managed to say to him. She said, "Why?" He understood the question. He said, "Because he asked me to, and because in 40 years of working a line, You learn that a man's word is the only thing he owns. The pay can be taken from you, and the pension can be taken from you, and the line itself can be taken from you. But the word you give to another man that you keep, that is yours. He looked at his coffee. He said, "And because I loved him, child, I am sorry if that is a strange thing to say. I had a wife and 2 daughters, and they are all gone now to lives of their own in other states. Your grandfather and I worked 12-hour shifts together for 38 years. We ate out of the same lunch pail. We slept in the same bunk room in Roanoke. We pulled each other out of more than one bad place. I have not had another friend like that, and I will not have another friend like that. When he asked me to wait for you, I would have waited 100 years." He stopped. He took a sip of his coffee. His hand was steady now. He said, 22 years is not so long when you put it next to 40. Della looked down at the key in her palm. She did not know what to say. She was 22 years old. She had spent the last 2 months sleeping in bus shelters. She had walked into a courthouse the day before yesterday with $38 in her pocket and had walked out of it with the deed to a rail car. She had broken a sealed door with a stone and a piece of rebar. She had read a letter from a dead man she had never met. And now she was sitting in a diner across from another dead man's friend, holding the key to a post office box that had been paid for every December for 22 years by the rough, enormous hand of the man across the table. She thought she might break. She did not break. She put the key inside her coat. She reached across the table and she put her 2 small, chapped hands on top of Wilbur Hadley's 2 huge, knotted ones. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. He turned his hands over slowly, the way a man turns a flag over in his hands at a funeral, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they sat that way for a long time. Norma Jean refilled the coffee without speaking. Eleanor Whitmore wiped her face with her napkin and looked out the window. The diner clock ticked. Outside, the morning sun climbed over the eastern ridge and laid down a strip of pale gold across the floor of the square. After a while, Wilbur cleared his throat. He let her hands go. He said, "Eat your biscuits, child. Then we will walk to the post office." She did what he said. The post office was a small clapboard building on the north side of the square, with a flagpole out front and a faded sign over the door that said, "United States Postal Service." Wilbur held the door for her. Eleanor walked behind. Inside, there was a single small room with a wall of brass post office boxes on the left and a counter on the right, and a black and white photograph of the previous Postmaster General on the wall behind the counter. Box 47 was in the 3rd row up. Della stood in front of it. The little brass door was about the size of a paperback book. She fitted the key into the lock. She turned it. The lock made the soft mechanical click of a mechanism that had been kept oiled for a long time, and the door swung open. The box was full. It was packed solid with envelopes, plain manila envelopes, the kind you buy at any drugstore, each one numbered in black ink in the top right corner. The numbers ran from 1 to 247. Della reached in and pulled out the first envelope. It was heavy. She opened the flap. Inside was a stack of yellow legal pad pages covered front and back in her grandfather's careful, slanting script. The first page was dated April 12th, 1995. She read the first 3 lines. "You were not born yet when I wrote this. Maybe you will not be born for years. I do not know your name. I am writing this to you anyway." Della put her hand flat against the wall to keep her balance. Wilbur and Eleanor stood behind her in the small post office, and they did not speak. They had known what was in the box, and they had not opened it. The privacy of those envelopes had belonged to a girl who had not been born when the first page was written, and they had honored it for the whole of their long lives. Della closed the envelope. She did not read more right now. She could not read more right now. She put the envelope back into the box. She closed the brass door. She locked it. She put the key into her inside pocket next to the watch and the deed. She turned around. She said to Wilbur Hadley, "Will you walk back up there with me? I do not want to be there alone today." He said, "Yes, child, I will." The afternoon they spent in the clearing was the beginning of the next 20 years of Della Mae Crawford's life, although she did not know it yet. She and Wilbur sat in the corridor of the Pullman, with the door propped open to the sun, and they drank coffee out of a thermos he had brought up from the village, and he told her stories. He told her about a steam locomotive that had broken down in a blizzard in '61, and how he and Elias had worked on the firebox for 9 hours in the snow until they got her running. He told her about the time Elias had pulled a deer out of a frozen pond. He told her about the way her grandfather had laughed, which was almost never, but when he did, it was a sound like rocks rolling down a hill. He did not tell her everything that day. He could not. There was too much. There were 38 years of work and friendship and small private kindnesses, and you cannot fit 38 years into one afternoon. But he made a beginning. He told her enough that by the time the sun started to drop behind the western ridge, she felt as though she had known her grandfather for a little while. The way you know a man whose photograph you have looked at for an hour. Wilbur walked her back down to the village at dusk. He did not stay. He had his own house to get to a small frame place on a side street with a wood stove and a tabby cat and a refrigerator full of casseroles brought over by the widows of the church. He shook her hand at the courthouse steps, and he said he would come up to the rail car the next Sunday and bring her some tools, because she would need tools. He said the place could be fixed up to live in if a person had the will. He said he could see she had the will. Then he walked away across the square in the long blue dusk. His shoulders slightly stooped under his wool coat, his breath making white clouds in front of him. Della watched him go. Then she went to the bank. The bank in Ridgemont was a branch of First Citizens, a small office on the east side of the square that closed at 5 o'clock. She made it inside at 4:40. The teller was a young woman about Della's own age. Della laid down one of the silver dollars from the rail car on the counter, and the cigar box was open in her backpack, with a wrapped stack of the United States notes inside. And she said in the steady voice she had learned from her mother that she needed to speak with the bank manager. The bank manager was a man named Carl Sutton, in his early 60s with a kind, tired face and a small American flag pin on his lapel. He took Della into his office. He closed the door. He looked at the silver dollar. He looked at the bundle of old red seal banknotes. He looked at the deed to the rail car that Della had spread out on his desk. He sat back in his chair, and he was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "You are Elias Crawford's granddaughter." She said, "Yes, sir." He said I knew him. Not well. I was a young loan officer at the branch in Asheville when he came in '74 with the settlement check from the railroad. He cashed the check and walked out with the cash in a paper bag and would not let us put it in an account. We thought he was crazy. He was not crazy. He just did not trust us. He was right not to. Carl Sutton smiled a small private smile. He said, "Child, what can I do for you?" What he did for her over the next 3 weeks was the work of opening a door from one life into another. He helped her open a checking account. He helped her contact a numismatic appraiser in Charlotte who came up on the second day and spent 6 hours in the rail car with a loop and a notebook. The appraiser's preliminary estimate, conservative just for the gold and the rarest of the silver, was $190,000. The paper currency, much of which was in mint condition and included several rare series, was estimated at another $120,000. The remaining silver and the ordinary banknotes added up to roughly $30,000 more, $340,000. Della did not feel rich. The number was so large that it had no meaning. She could not eat the number. She could not sleep inside the number. The number was a weather pattern somewhere over her head, and her own life was still a small specific thing happening on the ground beneath it. What the number meant in practical terms was that for the first time in her life, she did not have to be afraid of the first of the month. That was enough. That was almost more than she could hold. She used a small piece of it to buy an old Ford F-150 from a man in the village whose son had moved to Charlotte and did not need it anymore. She paid him in cash, and he wrote her out a bill of sale on a paper napkin. She used another small piece to buy tools, lumber, a generator, a battery bank, solar panels, a wood stove. She used a piece to pay back Otis Doyle, who had not asked, and who tried to refuse, and who took it in the end only because she put the envelope on the counter of his truck stop and walked out without saying goodbye. The rest she put in the bank. She moved up to the clearing on the first day of February. The cold was still hard, but the days were stretching. Wilbur came on Sundays with his toolbox and his old man's wisdom, and over the course of the spring, she and he together brought the Pullman heavyweight back from the dead. She tore the welded plates off the windows of the back compartment. The first time the sunlight fell on those shelves of cigar boxes after 50 years of darkness, she had to sit down on the parquet floor and put her hand over her mouth because the light made everything look different. The cedar was honey gold. The mahogany walls of the corridor were warm and alive. The brass fittings on the doors and the bench seats and the reading lamps caught the light and held it and gave it back. And she understood for the first time that her grandfather had not built a tomb. He had built a chapel. He had built it dark only because he had needed it kept safe, and he had trusted that whoever came for it would know how to open the windows. She ran water from the spring above the clearing through a buried polyethylene line down to a small reservoir bolted under the chassis. She mounted solar panels along the curve of the roof. She put a wood stove in the corridor and ran the chimney up through the ceiling with a careful flashing of high-temperature silicone. She replaced the mattress in the last compartment with a real one. She hung curtains. She put up a small set of shelves in what had been the sealed room, and she laid out the photograph of her grandfather and the enamel tin and the pocket watch in a row that she could see when she sat at the little folding table to drink her morning coffee. Then she began to read the letters. She read them in order, one a day. She did not allow herself to read more than one because there were 247 of them, and she wanted them to last. She read them on the bench in the corridor with the morning sun coming in through the eastern windows, and a mug of coffee in her hand, and the pocket watch ticking softly on the shelf behind her. Her grandfather had been a man of small, specific kindnesses. He wrote her about how to tell a brook trout from a brown trout by the spots on the side. He wrote her about how to read weather from the way the smoke rose out of a chimney. He wrote her about the war in the Pacific and the friends he had buried there, and the silence he had carried home with him. He wrote her about her grandmother, a woman named Adeline who had died of pneumonia in 1968, and whom he had loved for the 18 years he had been allowed to. He wrote her about Hollis as a child, before whatever crack had opened in him, had opened when he had still been a small boy who liked to fish with his father in the creek above the rail car. He wrote her about the day Hollis left. He did not curse his son. He never cursed his son. He wrote about him the way a man writes about a country he has loved and lost. There was sorrow in those pages, but there was no bitterness. Della read those particular letters slowly and twice, and she thought about her father, the man whose old coat she still wore, and she thought about the unknowable weight he had been carrying when he climbed into his pickup on that January night and drove out of her life forever. She did not forgive him. She did not yet know how to do that. But she began in the reading of those pages to understand him a little. An understanding she discovered was its own kind of mercy. She lived in the rail car for the rest of that year, and for many years after. Wilbur Hadley came every Sunday until his knees would no longer carry him up the trail. And after that, she went down and got him in the F-150 and drove him as far as the viaduct. And they sat on the parapet of the bridge with thermoses of coffee and looked at the river and talked. He died in the autumn of her 4th year on the rail car. She was 30 by then. She sat with him in his small frame house in the village for the last 3 days, and she held his huge knotted hand at the end, and she promised him she would keep the place loved. She kept her promise. She carved their 3 names into the wood above the doorway of the back compartment with a chisel and a small wooden mallet, working slowly the way her grandfather had worked his own words into the welded steel. The names were arranged on 3 lines evenly spaced in clean Roman capitals: Elias, Loretta, Della Mae. 3 generations of Crawfords. The grandfather who had waited, the mother who had endured, the girl who had walked alone into the woods with $10 in her pocket and had come back out with a family. In time, the rail car became something more than a home. Word traveled the way word travels in mountains. Other young women began to find their way to Ridgemont women who had walked out of their own trailers with backpacks on their shoulders. Women who had been thrown away by the same America that had thrown away Della Mae Crawford. They came 1 or 2 at a time. Della put them up in a small cabin she had built at the edge of the clearing. She fed them. She listened to them. She did not preach at them, and she did not save them. She showed them that there was a rail car in the woods that had been waiting 50 years for one specific person to come and claim it, and that some kinds of waiting are not waste. She called the place Crawford Station. There was no sign. There was no listing. The young women found it the way Della had found it, by hearing a stray sentence on a Greyhound bus. by following the iron of an old rail bed, by walking alone towards something they could not yet see. Most of them stayed only for a season. Some stayed longer. Many of them moved on into lives that had room in them at last. And a few of them came back over the years and sat with Della on the steps of the Pullman in the long evenings and told her what their lives had grown into. On Sunday mornings for the rest of her life, Della Mae Crawford sat in the corridor of the rail car with a mug of coffee and the pocket watch ticking on the shelf. And she read one page from one of her grandfather's letters. She had 247 envelopes. Some of them held many pages. At the rate of one page a Sunday, she calculated that first spring that the letters would last her until she was 61 years old. She turned out to be a few months off. She finished the last letter on a Sunday morning in April, when she was 62. The page was short. It was undated like all the rest. It said only that he hoped she had been well. It said that he hoped she had been loved. It said that the writing of the letters had been the company he had been given when nothing else had stayed, and that if she was reading this last one, it meant she had stayed with him a long time. And he was grateful. It said at the bottom in the careful, slanting hand she now knew as well as her own, "I never stopped thinking of you." Della folded the letter. She put it back into envelope 247. She set it on the shelf beside the others. She walked out of the rail car and stood on the platform of the south vestibule. The morning was clear. The eastern light fell across the clearing in long, pale columns through the trees. Somewhere in the high branches, a wood thrush was singing the slow descending phrase that means the spring has finally come, and the air was full of the smell of opening earth. She had spent her last $10 40 years ago on a rusted ghost in a forgotten forest, and she had inherited a grandfather who had never stopped loving her. She stood there in the morning sun, an old woman now with her white hair cut short and her hands as scarred as any working man's. And she thought of Elias Crawford in 1976, lifting a chisel to a piece of welded steel and cutting the words for the one who would walk alone in the faith that someday in a country he could not see, his blood would walk through the door she had walked through. She closed her eyes and turned her face up to the sun, and the pocket watch on the shelf inside ticked patiently on the way it had ticked for 40 years, on the chain of an old engineer, and the way it had ticked for 22 years, in the silent dark of a sealed compartment, and the way it would tick on she suspected for a long time, after she herself was gone. Some kinds of waiting are not waste. She had learned this from her grandfather, who had learned it from 40 years of running a line through these mountains where the steel of the rail lay quiet under the snow and the leaves in the long indifferent seasons, and yet was always there, always waiting, always ready to carry whatever came next. The clearing was quiet around her. The Pullman stood on its short, dead siding in the morning light, with its 3 carved names above the door, and its windows open to the spring. And Della Mae Crawford, the last of the Crawfords, and the keeper of the line opened her eyes and went back inside to make another pot of coffee.